Everything you've heard about Russia's brotherhood of nations is a myth. Over 100 different ethnic groups, countless languages, and radically different cultures, yet somehow they've been held together under one flag for centuries. But unity does not come naturally. To control its vast, resource rich territories, Russia must channel human lives, wealth, and power into a single centralized force capable of crushing resistance. The result is a carefully constructed illusion of harmony, hiding a reality of tensions, suppression, and simmering resentment beneath the surface. I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the USSR, and today we are going to take apart this intricate machinery to reveal the surprising ways Russia keeps this fragile unity intact, often against all odds. The central idea behind Russian policy toward its subjects is that the union of nations is voluntary. During the Tsarist era, it was claimed that smaller nations willingly joined the Russian Empire because they wanted to. In some cases, this was true, and the state propaganda used these examples to promote the idea of a voluntary union. For instance, Russian textbooks tell the story of Georgia, the small Christian country in the Caucasus, joining Russian Empire due to threats from the Ottoman Empire and Persia. Since Russia was also a Christian nation, like Georgia, the Georgian elites chose to align with Russia, fearing mass slaughter at the hands of Muslim invaders. But there were many instances where lands, along with their inhabitants, were taken by force, often leading to catastrophic loss of life. One such example is the Finnish experience at the beginning of the 18th century when Russia and Sweden divided their land, decimating the local population. However, Russian textbooks prefer to overlook these inconvenient facts. Even in cases of voluntary integration, peaceful coexistence, or the free development of smaller nations was never the reality. Russia, first and foremost, was a colonial power. Like other colonial empires of the time, the Russian government extracted resources, suppressed resistance, and built infrastructure to make exploitation more efficient. On one hand, this brought education, healthcare, postal services, telegraph industry, and other modern amenities to the far corners of empire. On the other hand, equality was never part of the plan. The Russians were clear about who the masters were, who the vassals were, and, in many cases, who the second class citizens were. So, the primary principle of Russian politics towards its people is to create an alternative reality, a set of beliefs that distorts historical facts, omits uncomfortable truths, and emphasizes what looks good on paper. If the state says we are all one big loving family of nations, then that's how it is. And if you don't love your family enough, especially the head of the family, Mother Russia, then you are sent to Siberian hard labor camps. To understand how Russian policy towards nationalities evolved, we must first look at the formation of the Russian Empire. During the age of exploration, Western Europe focused on expanding its territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Russian monarchs shared the same desire for more resources and power. However, unlike the European powers, Russia was a landlocked country, making overseas expeditions impossible. Russia briefly captured Alaska, but maintaining control was difficult due to issues with its navy and ports. With no way to extend overseas, Russia turned to colonizing neighboring lands, from Poland to China. This was possible because Russia had a steady income from trade, supplying Europe with furs, shipbuilding materials, candle wax, and later metals and grain. This trade brought revenue, enabling Russian tsars to build and maintain an army for further expansion. More territories meant more tributes, taxes, and commodities for trade, all of which added to Russia's power. A simple but effective strategy. After shaking off Mongol rule, the Grand Principality of Moscow began gradually annexing neighboring lands. Initially, it expanded into Slavic territories, where people spoke various dialects of Old Russian. But soon, Moscow moved into regions with no direct ties to Russian culture. One notable example is the conquest of the Kazan Khanate in the mid 16th century. This Muslim state in the Volga region controlled key trade routes between Russia and Persia via the Caspian Sea, and the Moscow Tsar decided it should remain under Russian control, right? Many other states and tribes suffered the same fate. And by the end of the 19th century, Russia had absorbed over 100 nations. Russian Tsars took immense pride in the diversity of the peoples they ruled. In the 18th and 19th centuries, grand court events were held where representatives from the conquered nations would arrive dressed in traditional costumes adorned with ethnic symbols. These gatherings showcased the empire's diversity. Buddhist monks from Kalmykia, Kazakhs with golden eagles for falconry, Tatar women draped in coin necklaces and silks, and reindeer herders. While these spectacles were impressive, the peoples showcased spoke different languages, followed different religions, and had very weak economic connections, if any. So those in power faced the daunting task of holding all of these diverse groups together. Managing the Russian Empire was no easy feat. How do you impose control over people who not only don't speak your language, but are also largely illiterate? And on the empire's fringes, there were customs and practices that were completely unacceptable to Russian authorities. For example, steppe dwellers who officially answered to the Russian Tsar would capture Russian soldiers and turn them into slaves. What was the big deal? After all, it was just military spoils. The dilemma was clear. If you gave the local elite more resources and power, they might rebel because they'd prefer to be the number one in their own land, not just a servant in Russia. But if they didn't have any resources, it would harm the economy and tax revenue. Self government for the smaller nations was out of the question. It contradicted the idea of absolute monarchy, which has been central to Russian politics. So the solution was forced Russification and the cooptation of local elites while eliminating any groups that resisted Russian control. The ideal subject in the eyes of the imperial government was a Russian speaking Orthodox individual with deeply conservative views. Someone who believed that all power came from God and that their primary duty was to serve the Tsar. Russia did its best to mold all its subjects into this form. A unified cultural, religious, and linguistic space meant manageability. You couldn't recruit local officials to serve Russian power if they didn't speak Russian. You couldn't rely on religious leaders whose ideals were incompatible with imperial policies. You couldn't cultivate professionals who dreamed of independence from Russia. And you couldn't have local elites whose power came from local traditions or popular support rather than the Tsar's regime. The key strategy was to ensure that all decent education was conducted in Russian and career opportunities were available only to those who integrated into centralized state system. For instance, if an ambitious young man from Poland wanted to serve his country and improve the situation for his people, he had to study Russian, join the ranks of the officials, and try to win favor with his Russian superiors. If he was lucky, he could make a decent career, but not in Poland. There, no one would allow it. But he would gain important connections and perhaps do something useful for his people. If he did not like this plan, he could join underground Polish nationalist groups, eventually get arrested, and be sent to Siberia to do hard labor. Arrests weren't for crimes, They were for engaging in open discussions about national issues. The same scenario played out across the empire, from the Baltics and Ukraine to Yakutia. Of course, the further from the capital, the less pressure there was on local intellectuals and elites. But the general trend, I believe, is clear. If this video provides value for you, consider subscribing. It truly helps the channel grow. And if you'd like to support my work directly, feel free to give a super thanks or buy me a coffee using the links below. Now, let's explore how local populations responded to these efforts at control and why Russia's attempts at forced Russification were often met with fierce resistance. This resistance often manifested in uprisings, but none of them had any hope of success. After all, the Russian authorities had a vast army, money, a professional bureaucracy, and weapons manufacturing on their side. Some nations held out longer, such as the small Muslim nations of the Caucasus in the 19th century. But their resistance was only possible because the war was fought in mountainous terrain, and the Russian army could not use its full strength against the locals. The area lacked roads, and artillery was useless in the rugged terrain. Guerrilla fighters could easily escape through wild trails, making it hard to track them down later. But, as usual, it ended the same way. Russia had countless compliant men, thousands of whom died at the hands of mountain warriors. The local Muslim men were decimated, trade routes were cut off, and even the most basic local economies began to collapse. Eventually, the surviving elites were given an offer they could not refuse: either join the Russian Tsar's service or their lineage would be erased from history. From there, the process was relatively smooth. The children of the elites went to Moscow or St. Petersburg, enrolled in universities, joined the civil service, married locals, and integrated into the power structure. They served both as hostages and as conduits for Russian culture. To this day, you'll find descendants of aristocratic families in the capitals with surnames that clearly have Asian, Polish, or other roots. There was one group with a very specific status in the Russian Empire: the Jews. By the end of the 19th century, Russia had over 5 million Jews, making them the fifth largest nation in the empire. But how did Jews, originally from the Middle East, end up there? After being expelled from Palestine, Jews spent centuries migrating through North Africa and Europe, driven by religious persecution. Eventually, they settled in Eastern Europe, in regions such as modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. When Russia gained these territories in the 18th century, it found itself with a population it didn't quite know how to handle. Judaism was seen as a dangerous religion by the Tsarist government, and they did everything they could to protect their citizens from the harmful influence of Jews. As a result, the Pale of Settlement was established, a designated zone where Jews were allowed to live and work. By the end of the 19th century, only 4% of the Jewish population could live outside the Pale, severely limiting their careers and opportunities. In addition to this, Jews were barred from owning land or holding government positions. The only way to succeed was through the arts, science, or trade. It was difficult for Jews to attend public schools or universities due to discriminatory quotas, and competition for spots was fierce. As a result, many Jewish parents poured all their resources into their children's education, cementing the stereotype of the typical Jewish child, always studying. As social tensions grew, it became convenient for the authorities to blame Jews for Russia's problems, accusing them of profiting from the misfortunes of the Russian people. This led to horrific anti-Jewish pogroms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driving many Jews to immigrate, particularly to the United States. I'm sure many of my viewers have ancestors from this wave of migration. Due to systematic discrimination under the Tsarist regime, many members of smaller nations became involved in the revolutionary movement and eventually took leadership roles in the first Soviet government. Notable figures included Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Soviet political police, which later became the KGB, who was Polish; Leon Trotsky, a leading political figure in the early USSR, who was Jewish; and even Joseph Stalin, who was Georgian. Stalin's political rivals, Zinoviev and Kamenev, were also Jewish. For many Russians, this was shocking. After Lenin's death, it seemed like minorities were taking all the power. While this was not entirely true, many Russians held positions in the Soviet government. Russian nationalists saw this as a threat, which fueled a new wave of anti Semitism and resentment. At first, the Bolsheviks aimed to radically change how nationalities were treated. They promoted equality and envisioned a voluntary union of national republics based on socialism. However, it did not take long for them to realize that many ethnic groups did not want to join Soviet Russia. They wanted to break away from it. Just like Finland and Poland had done, they sought independence. In response, the Bolshevik government adopted the same practices used under the Tsars. Leaders were appointed to national republics, local intellectuals were either eliminated or co opted, and funding was allocated for local education and culture to create the illusion of fairness. This led to the creation of national film studios, radio stations, and publishing houses. But the problem was with the audience. If you made a film in a local language, who would watch it? Educated people spoke Russian, and the national languages were largely spoken at home. Officially, schools taught local languages, but in practice, serious careers could only be made in Russian. All important films, books, and scientific materials were in Russian, creating a vicious circle. Investing in local culture just limited your exposure. Universities faced the same challenges. It was technically possible to study in a local language, but the quality of teaching in Russian was far superior. Professors found it much more beneficial to teach in Russian to advance their careers in the broader scientific world. The Soviet government maintained the tradition of forced Russification. It was much easier to be Russian, or at least Ukrainian or Belarusian. But if you looked different, it was a different story, especially for Jews, gypsies, and those with Asian appearances. Some people tried to change their names to ones that sounded more Russian, but nationality still had a huge impact on one's opportunities. It was listed in Soviet passports, and changing it was not an easy process. Despite the forced Russification, the Soviet government worked hard to create the illusion of a brotherhood of nations. In kindergartens and schools, holidays were organized to celebrate the friendship between nations. Children dressed in national costumes, danced traditional dances, and the walls were adorned with posters showing this unity. Television and the press regularly featured reports on life in the brotherly republics. Posters of representatives from various nationalities holding hands were displayed in school and other public places. News broadcasts showed Communist Party congresses, where delegates from all across the Soviet Union would gather, much like the grand gatherings of Tsarist subjects at the royal court. Officially, everyone believed in the friendship of nations. It was simply taken for granted. But in private life, things looked very different. Soviet society remained highly chauvinistic due to a lack of exposure to other cultures. Most Soviet people lived in cities and villages with others of the same ethnicity. In the capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg, and in border cities, there were more diverse populations. But the further from these cities you went, the more homogeneous the population became, and the more national stereotypes and prejudice took root. There was a whole range of humiliating nicknames for smaller nations in the Russian language. In my youth, I never heard any that were used to describe Russians. But since the war in Ukraine began, social media has provided plenty of examples. But I don't go in details. Don't ask. There were countless jokes about different nationalities. Jews were portrayed as greedy and sly, Chukchas as simpletons, Armenians as eccentric, and Georgians as overly passionate. Russians in these jokes were portrayed as either irrational or as people who could always find a crazy solution to any problem. If you know any jokes about Russians, please share in the comments. It would be fun to look at. Chauvinism is, in fact, common for humans. Scientists say that we instinctively distrust those who don't resemble us because for our ancestors it was a matter of life and death. Outsiders who were too different might bring diseases we had no immunity to, so we instinctively rejected them. This biological program developed over hundreds of thousands of years. The only way to switch it off is by living side by side and interacting with people who are different from you for a long time. Over time, you begin to see them as your own. This is what happens here in Southern California, at least in the city where I live. My neighbors include Indians, Koreans, Chinese, Arabs, and Persians. Local schools are fully integrated and there is no national majority. As a result, the concept of racism is virtually non existent for our children. My novel Russian Treasures tells the story of the Russian Revolution and how the Bolsheviks gained power in 1917. This was possible because the internal structure of the Russian Empire collapsed and smaller, more organized political groups, along with national minorities, helped shape the new reality. The Latvian riflemen were crucial guards for the first Soviet government, and Chinese mercenaries became key members of the political police. There's also the long forgotten story of the British volunteer corps that joined the Russian Civil War, which almost changed the course of history in 1919. Unfortunately, Great Britain was too exhausted from the Great War to get involved, leaving the problem of Bolshevism to the next generations. It's a fascinating story. By the way, I've already published the second book in the Russian Treasures series, The White Ghosts Empire, which tells another incredible story of how tens of thousands of Russians who once considered themselves the supreme white race fled the Bolsheviks and ended up at the very bottom of society in China. The links to both books are in the description below.